Welcome again to Amritapuri Dialogue on a very special topic of Dharma and Social Evolution. This is a very intriguing and fascinating topic as we will be discussing about the India social hierarchy, its origin, its evolution, and the present day situations and challenges. So, now before we start the dialogue, I would like to introduce our speakers who have graciously accepted our invitation and have come here today. Firstly, Sri.Aravind Neelakandan sir. Aravindan Neelakandan is an author of the hugely successful and best-selling book Hindutva. He was the co-author of another bestseller book, Breaking India. As the contributing editor of Swarajya, he focuses mainly on culture, science, philosophy of science, and history. His understanding of the historical origins of both the Dravidian movement and Dalit identity, plus the current players involved in shaping these separatist identities, is unmatched. He has completed a cultural economics project under the Joint Research Fellowship from the Department of Culture, Government of India, on the ruins of Kanyakumari district and has field experience of culture conservation. In addition to Aravindan sir, we also have Suraj sir here with us for this session. He is an engineering graduate in computer science and has masters in philosophy. Before switching to academics, he has served in the IT sector for more than 11 years. He has presented research papers in various international academic conferences and also contributed articles for newspapers like Malayalam Manorama, The Pioneer, Janmabhoomi, and online media. He is pursuing his doctoral studies in the Indian caste system. Now, we live in a time where any discussion about the Indian society automatically leads to the very famous caste theory. India is labeled as a caste society, just like the racist societies of the West. And anytime the topic of India comes up, there's always a discussion about discrimination, endogamy, untouchability, etc. So today during this session, we are mainly trying to focus on if this is a valid point, if this is a fact or a myth. So now let me kickstart our today's discussion with Suraj sir. Sir, since our topic of discussion today is Dharma and Social Evolution, the question would be, is there any way forward with this? Like, is there anything more that we can research and learn upon? Or is it a very cut and dry topic and all the conclusions already found out?
Okay, thank you for the question. And Nandana, let me just put it this straight away. Like, this is not a cut and dry topic. Many of you might, who have researched on Indian society might be thinking that, okay, fine, there is caste hierarchy and there are certain things which was actually codified during the colonial time. And there is fundamentally a flow in the way we think, actually. And that is mainly because we might have been politically independent, but I really think that we are far from, our minds are still under the influence of colonialism. And this is something which we have not explored till now. And that is where these kinds of theories come. Like your introduction itself says like caste is something equivalent to racism in the West. It is actually not. And the caste hierarchy theory was coined in India during the colonial time. And one thing what we Indians did was we unintentionally give away the space to the Indologists in the West to research about India, and then whatever they told about India, we accepted it without cross-checking whether it is fact or not. And even the post-independence time, that continued. Like our scholars too didn't research properly, like whatever Europeans have theorized, we accepted it. So that is a mistake from our side, and it is the need of the hour to rethink India's past in a proper manner. And when I say rethink, there is a scope. Like the field itself thrives on the multiplicity of views. So we need multiple views, and we need to really restudy about the Indian society, and that too not just the 200-year history. We need to start from the Vedic age. How was the society during the Vedic age? Then the classical age in India. Then, of course, about the colonial time. Colonialism is, normally it is defined as a phenomenon which affected us economically, but it is not like that. It is something which has affected us. It has taken our minds as well. Like colonialism has looted our minds as well. So we need to invest time to understand how colonialism affected our psyche, and then about the present time. Here I want to coin one more thing, like, the caste hierarchy theorized by the European scholars, if that was right, then how could a Nanda dynasty rule Magad? How could people like Chandragupta Maurya become king? How could people like, for example, in South Vijayanagara kingdom, who invented Vijayanagara kingdom? And when it comes to knowledge, how can a person like Jnaneshwara become the sage, great sage of all time? So there is a scope to rethink about India's past, and that too starting from the Vedic age. This is my introduction note to your question.
Thank you, sir. Sir, Aravindan sir, Suraj sir is saying that this topic is not a completely resolved one and that there's more research that needs to take place for this. He also says that while researching on it, we should divide it into like mainly three parts, which is the Vedic age, including the Harappan time, then the time where there was social emancipation occurred in India, and the post-independence time. Sir, so could you brief us about the Indian society during the Vedic ages?
When we talk about the Vedic age, we have to be clear about one very important thing. It is that the Vedic society was like any other human society of that period. So what was any other human society of that period like at that time? All the human societies, whether it is Egypt, whether it is Mesopotamia, whether it is the ancient European period, they all had social stratification. We should be very clear about it. They all had social stratification. There was a kind of a hierarchy in which the people were considered as the elite, some people were considered as powerful, some people were considered as economically more prosperous, and then there were some people who were considered as excluded from the society. So when you have social stratification, naturally two things will come out. One is social aristocracy. People who have undue advantage in the society. Okay. Either because of their merit or because of their position or because of their birth. There will also be people who will be excluded from the society. Either because they were extremely straightforward or because they did something wrong, whatever. So they were excluded from the society. So any society of ancient times, for that matter even today, all the societies will have social stratification, social aristocracy, social exclusion. And there will be specific cultural terms for this social hierarchy, social exclusion, social aristocracy. Here we have this term Brahmana Kshatriya. We have the term Chandala. We tell that, then we have the term Shudra. The Chandalas are the people who are outside. They have been excluded from the society. The Brahmana Kshatriyas are the elite of the society. And you have this structure here. And all pre-modern societies, remember this, all pre-modern societies, like before 300 years, all the societies, this was mostly birth-based. Mostly this was birth-based. It is only after the modernity comes, only after the democracy becomes a social institution, these notions start getting challenged. So what is special about the Vedic society? As I said, the Vedic society was just like any other society, but the Vedic values challenged this social stratification. You have to understand this. The Vedic values, those values challenged the social stratification. They spoke against social exclusion. Okay? So I will give a solid example for this. In Sadapada Brahmana is the story of Kavashaha. So Kavashaha was the son of a woman who was working in gambling houses. Okay? But he was a great rishi, particularly to do Adhiratra Yajna. The Soma Yajna, Adhiratra Yajna, he was the greatest rishi of that time. The great performer of Yajna, he was known as. But he was born of this woman who worked in gambling houses. So there was a big drought and there has been no rain. They wanted to do a Adhiratri Yajna and they had brought Kavashaka also. All the great rishis were there, Kavashaka was also there. Then one person started raising the question, this guy is of not a noble lineage. His mother was a woman who was working in the gambling houses. How could he sit here? and the word used it, he is a Brahmana. He cannot be considered as a Brahmana. So let us throw him out. So everybody talks and then they decide, okay, this guy should be thrown out. He is thrown out. And then in that agony, in that particular time of trauma, Kavashaka becomes a mantra drishta. And he sings certain important hymns of Rigveda, which are addressed to Saraswati. And Saraswati becomes the river and she comes and starts flowing around him. The people who threw him out were actually conducting a yajna for bringing the water, and here is the person who has been excluded from the society, who stands outside and he bursts into a song, and Saraswati herself comes. So you see, the social reality was that there was social exclusion. But the spiritual reality was that the Rigveda said, and the Sadapada Brahmana says, that you cannot exclude a person because every soul is potentially divine. Okay. So that is the basis of Hindu spirituality. If you look at the social emancipation and the social evolution, you will always find that this spiritual core has been working every place else. It was not spirituality that brought social emancipation. I will dwell upon this later, so I think this addresses the question of how it was during the Vedic time.
So I had a small question regarding this. That is, in the Purusha Sukta segment of the Rig Veda, it mentions the Shudras being the feet. So, like, who likes to be the feet? So, doesn't this show a kind of exclusion or social hierarchy?
The 10th mandala of Rig Veda contains Purusha Sukta. And Purusha Sukta has been quoted again and again and again the last 200 years. Please take the older versions, the older accounts of history, and you will find that Purusha Sukta, this particular aspect of Purusha Sukta, of the Brahmana being the head and other things, is not talked about much. You take any of the hymns that have been made. Okay? This particular imagery is not used. Because there are actually two versions of the creation of the Varna. Actually, I would say two versions of the formation of the Varnas. One is Purusha Sukta, which has been quoted again and again, that whenever we talk about Varna, naturally we start thinking about Purusha Sukta only. But look at the Purusha Sukta very carefully, you will find the word Varna doesn't figure anywhere there. Okay? All the four divisions are given, but the word Varna is not told there. There is another one version of Varna formation that is given in Brihadaranya Upanishad. Now, Brihadaranya Upanishad and Purusha Sukta, if you take Purusha Sukta, comes, as I said, in the 10th mandala, which is the later part of the Rigvedic book. And Brihadaranya Upanishad is one of the earliest of the Upanishads, pre-Buddhist Upanishads. So, their time interval is almost, you can take, not exactly, but contemporaneous. Okay. So, here in Brihadaranya Upanishad, the definition, here, account is given. That is that initially everybody was Brahmana. And then the creative principle, it was not satisfied. It was not complete. It understood that the society was not complete. So from the Brahmanas came the Kshatriyas. From the Kshatriyas came the Vaishyas. From the Vaishyas came the Shudras. This it says. And then it felt it was complete. Again there was a problem. And then it said, it placed Dharma over the Kshatriyas. And then the Brihadaranya Upanishad says, that is why in the society, a person who does not have power can still get justice because Dharma is above the king. Dharma is sitting above the king. Now, I come from Kanyakumari district. If you know the history of Travancore, you would remember that there was a great social reformer called Ayya Vaikunta. He was a spiritual person. We call him social reformer. Okay, he was a spiritual person. He was considered by people there as a kind of an Amsavatara of Vishnu. Okay. And he gave a definition of Dharma. He said that Thala Kadapavare Tarkarpadu Dharma. Okay. What is the meaning of that? It is, you should protect the persons who don't have power as your own self. Note the very important point here. As your own self. Thala Kadapavare Tarkarpadu. Like, protect like you are protecting yourself. That means you have to have an Advaitic unity with the person who is suffering. And that empathy is Dharma. Now you take Brihadaranya Upanishad. Brihadaranya Upanishad and Ayya Vaiyundar are separated by at least 5,000 years. And you see the same voice. That it says that the powerless get justice because of Dharma being placed above the king. And here it is said, protecting the powerless as your own self is Dharma. Now, this continuity is very important. And this is the important aspect because Purusha Sukta, again coming back to Purusha Sukta talks about these four differences in the society. It doesn't use the word Varna, but it compares it with the already existing natural order, natural scheme of things. So you can say that this is a kind of social creation perspective. What the Brihadaranya Upanishad says is the evolutionary perspective, social evolutionary perspective. So this is more flexible, more dynamic, and this is what been applied in the society. If you want a proof of this, you will find one thing. In the Visurupa Darshana of Bhagavad Gita, he describes everything as part of himself. He does not mention this particular division of Purusha Sukta as part of him. So this is actually an insight into how we actually viewed. When the British came, they only projected the Purusha Sukta and told that this was made to suppress the people.
Sir, now to Suraj sir. There is a different topic of discussion normally which comes up along with this. That is that Buddha did not like the Brahmins. And there's always a conflict between Buddha and Brahmanism. So how far is this story actually true? Is there anything behind it? Or is it just a made up story?
Like from the Aravind sir's answer, like the concept of Brahmanism or Brahmins, that was there in India, even I think like that. But this conflict between Buddha versus the people who followed or the people who followed rituals or Vedas. So this topic I have a doubt. I have a doubt in a sense, if you go and read Dharmapada, the book written by Buddha, chapter number 26, if I rightly remember, it mentions about some concept called Brahmins, and where Buddha says, like a person who has good spiritual insight can be considered as a Brahmin. It means Buddha himself is telling about a good Brahmin actually. And he further says that the person who follows Dharma and truth can be called as a Brahmin. This is there in Dharmapada. So, my problem with this conflict theory is like, if a person who promoted the idea himself talks about the concept of Brahmin, then how can he have any kind of conflict with this particular group, if they existed? Now, but this is a topic where we need to research more. Why? Because, and I think since Aravindan sir being here, in his latest book, if I really remember again, if my memory serves me right, in the 481th page in Hindutva book, the subtopic itself is Brahmanism versus heterodox. So, sir, if you can elaborate about the Brahmin versus Buddha, what really was, how that story got like popularized in India.
So, again, here we see another one big problem of colonialism. Because, see, in terms of the inner doctrines, there can be differences between the different sects that were there in ancient India. Okay. So, if you see, for example, the Nyaya school, the Vaiseshika school, the Buddhist school, there will be differences in doctrines. But they were all held together by a common culture, and that common culture was not questioned by Buddha. When the colonial intellectuals came, they saw Buddha as a kind of, who was their enemy? The enemy were the people who were considered as the custodians of religion. And they identified who were all Brahmins then as their enemies in their evangelical or civilizing mission. When they were doing this particular thing, they wanted to create a historiography, and when they were looking at ancient India, they found this figure of Buddha. And then they said, okay, this Buddha was this ancient Martin Luther of India, who fought against the Brahminical tyranny. So what they did was, they did a kind of reverse engineering in a faulty way. They mapped Buddha to Martin Luther. When you map Buddha to Martin Luther, they had to map the priestcraft to Brahmins. and then make Buddha a strong opponent of Brahminism. Buddha was not comfortable with the external karma kanta of Vedas. He was internalizing them. He was telling that the real way of worshipping the fire is Agnihotra, is by doing the homage to the fire of consciousness inside. So he was creating this kind of aspects. But the rejection of the entire karma kanda didn't happen with Buddha. What he told was minimize the violence. He was not comfortable with the violence also. Right. Apart from that, did he actually challenge the society? Did he want to create a varnaless society? There is no proof of that anywhere. He had accepted the varnas. He even at times argued for the varna superiority. If certain of the later suttas, like Ambuta Sutta, if you are going to take those suttas and see, you may even argue that Buddha was in favor of a kind of Kshatriya superiority. In fact, this Brahmana Kshatriya fight has always been there. As you can see in Ramayana itself, you don't have to go to Buddha. You can see in Ramayana, you will find Parashurama's anger towards the Kshatriyas, and then Rama being a Kshatriya does the Garva Bhanga of Parashurama. You can see a subtle Brahmin Kshatriya rivalry there, and you can also say, you can, if you want, okay, it's nonsensical, but if you want, you can tell that the entire Ramayana is anti-Brahmin, because after all, who is the chief villain of Ramayana? It was Ravana who was a Brahmin. And whose Garvabhanga Rama does? It is Parashurama's, who was a Brahmin. And despite the fact that Vasishta was his guru, who was the actual guru of Rama? Viswamitra, who was a Kshatriya. Right? So, if you want, you can even do, but we know, no, this is totally nonsense. Right? But if an Indologist had taken up this and had done, we should be actually happy that he didn't make Rama an anti-Brahmin. But anyway, coming back to this Buddha being made an anti-Brahmin, this started with the Westerners. Was there a conflict between Buddhism and some of the Vedic streams? There were conflicts, no doubt about it. There were conflicts. But Buddhism also accepted Rama as a bodhisattva. In Buddhist literature, Rama is a bodhisattva. Okay? You can find Krishna and Balarama in Jain literature as one of the Tirthankars. And you have Buddha accepted as avatara in Hinduism in two ways. You have to understand that in two ways. One is you find it in Gita Govinda, in Jayadeva's Dasavadara Stuti, in which Jayadeva very clearly states that as Buddha you came because of compassion, so that the animal sacrifices would be stopped. Okay, that is one way of looking. In another is that in Vishnu Purana it is said he came as a Maya Mogan, as Buddha, and he confused people so that some of the bad Kshatriyas were eliminated. Okay, so this way we also accepted Buddha as a part of this. The whole thing was created later. It doesn't have any proof. None other than Dr. Ambedkar, when he included Buddhists and Jains, and Ambedkar had even created a narrative that Buddhism is anti-Brahminism and all that. But when he created the Hindu Code Bill, you have to differentiate the rhetoric and the scholarship of Dr. Ambedkar. So in the scholarship of Dr. Ambedkar, when he created the Hindu Code Bill, he included Buddhists and Jains. So when he was asked why you have included Buddhists and Jains, he told that they all adhered to the same social laws. There were doctrinal differences, but they adhered to the same social laws. If Buddha was a social revolutionary against Brahminism, he should have opposed that. But that didn't happen. So he said, so I am including them. Legally, they are all Hindus. So I think that answers it.
Thank you, sir. That was truly a fascinating point of view. Now we can move on to the next question. Suraj sir, from your exploration addresses, is there anything intriguing and interesting that you have read about the Indian society and its hierarchy during the before common era?
Yes, really, yes, there is. The research about India didn't start 200 years before or 500 years before. It already started. Maybe it is a long history actually. So during the before common era, one book which I was tackled by reading is the book written by Herodotus, Indica. Then during 2300 BCE, I think Megasthenes came here and wrote Indica. There, since our topic is society in India during, I mean like society in India and its evolution, its origin and all. So Megasthenes in his book has written two important aspects. One thing is like he has divided the Indian society into 7 layers. He's not supportive of this 4-layered hierarchy system created during the colonial time. And this is, no, this was not read properly or this was not researched properly, I would suggest. Why? Because Megasthenes seems to have traveled across Pataliputra and he was a good scholar as well. And he further mentions this in his book. Yeah, he says that in India there was no slavery system. That was a time when almost all the countries across practiced slavery. So this again, many of the scholars didn't even touch this sentence. Why? Because no, this won't suit their political agenda. That could be the reason, I think. So this is one aspect. Like the Indian society was a 7-layer society, and there again he mentions one more thing, that Indian society hates any kind of disruption. Means the people were living very peacefully. So this is something which we need to note from the writings during the before Common Era time. But not just before Common Era time, we need to read the Islamic chronicles as well. Like one book which, again, I would like to bring the attention towards that book. That book, the book name is Tabaki Nasri, written by Minaji Siraj in the 11th century, where he mentions Buddhists, the people who were following Buddha as the ones, and I mean like the terminology used for this particular group is clean-shaven Brahmins. Like they were actually the followers of Buddha. This shows that like he was a foreigner, came to our land, but he could not identify people who were living in this land based on their clothing or their attire. This again, many of our scholars didn't even look those sources. Like the contemporary sources, what was their understanding about Indian society? So when we, when we in the 21st century, if we really need to reinvent about our stories, we need to do it very truthfully. Like, we need to explore all the books which was written by people, not just Indians, like the people who came here and settled here and even started studying about India. So this is one area which, I think this is my answer to your question. Like before Common Era and even Common Era, there are books which we need to explore and read.
So that is definitely some new information that we need to digest and read more upon. So continuing on that same train of thought, Aravindan sir, could you explain about the Indian society during the classical age, that is during the Cholas, Chalukyas and the Guptas, and the impact that it had on us during that time?
It's a very interesting phase of India, particularly the classical age, okay? Because, see, as Dr. Suraj pointed out, during the Buddhist times, when the Westerners, the European chroniclers, when they came, they couldn't identify any big discrimination in India. But what we know from the internal evidences is that, and this is very important, untouchability was becoming institutionalized during this period. We have to understand this very clearly. You all would have been given this particular wisdom through your textbooks that it was Hinduism that created untouchability. Now, let me put forth a very blunt, counterintuitive statement. Untouchability is the gift of Jainism and Buddhism, or rather excessive attachment to the doctrines of Jainism and Buddhism to India. Why? Because for the first time, a particular work was getting associated with being defiled in a doctrinal manner by Jainism and Buddhism. For example, you are a hunter. Being a hunter is not considered as something wrong in the Vedic worldview. Whereas in Buddhist worldview and Jain worldview, with the excessive attachment to ahimsa, non-violence, a hunter was considered as a defiled person. Hunting was considered as a defiled trade. Similarly, you take music and dance. They were bards. They were minstrels. There were a class of people. In Tamil Nadu, in Sangam literature, you have a particular community called Banar. Banar are the people who would be singing. Okay, in Ceylon, if you go, there is a place called Yalpanam. Yal, you know, it is a string instrument. Yalpanam means the people who were using the string instrument, musicians using the string instruments used to live in that place. So it is called Yalpanam. So Jainism attached extraordinary importance to morality and ethics. And hence they upheld all the joys of life. So music was wrong, dance was wrong, and those who were doing music and dance were considered as untouchables. Ahimsa went even further extreme. That if you are using a plowshare to plow your land, so you will all consider vegetarianism as a kind of an ideal for Jainism and Buddhism. So for Jainism particularly, using the plowshare to plow the land would kill a lot of soil organisms. So they said that if you are using the plow with the iron share, then you belong to Pabayoni. You belong to bad community, inferior community. But remember this. So they even have a Jain way of agriculture actually with the wood. Wood stumps, they would plow the land and they would do it. They won't use the iron share. But they understood something very quick, that you cannot produce a food for the entire masses like this. So to produce food for the entire masses, you needed plowshare. You needed a community that uses the plowshare. So how do you justify it? Even now I think there is a particular proverb that we have, which is something like Konnal Pavam Thinnal Pochu. Remember that if you are killing an animal, it is a sin, but if you are eating an animal, it is not a sin. So something similar to that they brought. They said that, okay, this community is needed, but you are born in that community because you had done bad karma in the previous birth. So a doctrinal justification of certain communities being branded as inferior came with Jainism and Buddhism. Excessive Jainism and Buddhism. I would say Jainism and Buddhism mainstream, excessive Jainism and Buddhism. This created untouchability. This created social divisions. When Fahyan, during the Gupta time, when Fahyan comes, he comes to Madura. And Madura was at that time, he tells a lot of Buddha Vigaras are there. And he mentions about this untouchability. And he is not mentioning it in negative way. That is the most important thing. He says that if the fishermen or people used to come to enter the city, they have to make a voice and they have to play a drum and tell that we are entering here. And then they have to enter. Okay. And this was a Buddhist city at that time, Madura was. He is mentioning that also. Okay. So, during the classical time, coming back, during the classical time what happens is, there is a Vedic revival of Saivism and Vaishnavism. Saivism and Vaishnavism, when they were reviving through the Bhakti movement, they were using the Bhakti movement, they are coming back, they told that Bhakti is enough, you don't care about this kind of distinctions. So this was a direct attack actually on Buddhism and Jainism. Now you know that Mahabharata is a layered text. Some of the texts in Mahabharata were actually post-Buddhist. One of that is Dharmavyada's story. So in Dharmavyada's story, you have a realized person, a Brahmana called Gautama. He goes and you know the story. I don't have to repeat it, I think. So think about it. Can you imagine a similar Buddhist tale where a person who goes in search of, joins the Sangha, comes and learns jnana from the hands of a butcher? Can you just imagine a story like that in Buddhism? Here, a Brahmana leaves the house, goes and does austerities. With just his eyes, he can kill a crane. With such yogic powers, he goes and learns jnana from two people. One is a woman and another one is a butcher. Right? So, these were all stories that emphasized the spiritual equality of humanity. And this comes from this Saivism and Vaishnavism. This Saivite Vaishnavite revival is the base of the great empires that got created. Remember, the Magadha Empire, once it accepted Buddhism, it started becoming weakened. And then at one particular point of time, it couldn't even resist the Greek invasions again. Okay. And then you have the Gupta Empire, and before the Gupta Empire, you have the confederacy of under Karavela and Yasodharma. There is a combination of Indian kings who fought against the Huns and defeated them, right? And a person like Professor Upinder Singh points out that that was the time of the Saivite revival in India. So the Saivite revival and the Vaishnavite revival were the basis of the empire building that happened in the classical period of India. So whether it is the Gupta Empire, whether it is Chola or Rashtrakuta, Chalukya, all these empires, they had at its base this Saivite Vaishnavite revival that united again the entire society that was kind of compartmentalized by the Buddhist and the Jain.
Thank you, sir. That was a very fascinating answer. So now to move on to the next question, sir. From the discussions and answers so far, we can say that India had an intermixing of jati. So is there any jati where such an intermixing was not occurring or it was stopped and that has caused it to decline or get lost?
Yes, intermixing happened in India, and here I would like to point about, bring your attention towards certain wars which happened in India, like one which I now remember as Jats in the north fought against Muhammad bin Qasim. And how many of you are from Andhra? There are many. All the Andhras fought invaders. Andhras, like the Jati Andhras. And then there are people like Sikh, there are people like, no, I forgot the name of certain Jatis. Like they all fought invaders. And what happened during this wars are like, after the war, before getting captured by the invader, what these people normally do is like they'll flee to the forest. Like till date, they might have been a Kshatriya fighting against the invader, but all of a sudden, their status changed. This is neatly mentioned by the great historian K.S. Lal in his book Medieval Growth of Scheduled Tribe in India. K.S. Lal, one historian whom we should actually read, and if you need to understand the Indian society properly, especially the northern area. So here, the one jati who were prominent after certain wars against the invaders, they lost their status and they were forced to flee. They were forced to flee and even settle in forest. Once they started living in the forest, their life also changed. Means the status changed. They were fighting for bread and butter, and they started doing menial jobs. And many who were caught during the war were forced to do slavery, like they were captive. And I mean, like, you know, once you are caught by an invader, they won't just treat you with love. Instead, they will make you slave, and here again, the status changed. So, invasion too have changed the status of Indian society. That again, I'm like, this topic is not a well-researched topic. K.S. Lal have done a preliminary work about the Indian society during the invasions, like different invasions. I think we need to study more about that particular topic and how the social scenario changed. Even now, I'm researching on a village in Uttarakhand, where I noticed a very interesting thing. Like in this particular Uttarakhand village, there's a group called Rajput. They have their own place to worship, and here the Brahmins are not allowed. It means what this tells us? Is there a hierarchy where the Brahmins are superior in the 21st century in India? No, it's not. Like there are areas where certain jati have their own kind of like their rules are framed by themselves and they follow that, and we don't have any problem with that. Like we are not. I mean, like this is not a strict hierarchy. Even now, it is not. I mean, like it's quite hard to prove the Western theories, and if we take those theories to the Indian villages, we will see the disparity. In a sense, it is completely different from what they have theorized about India. So this exists even now. So we need, again, this question need more research. I mean, like we need to understand the society in a much better manner than what all these people have understood and written down in various textbooks.
So now moving on from that to the next topic. Aravindan sir, it is normally said that in India, the saints were responsible of ridding our society of many evils, of many social evils. So, could you explain to us the actual contribution of the Bhakti movement saints during that time?
There is again a misconception that the saints were getting reduced to the level of social reformers. A very good example I would take is a very recent person like Sri.Narayana Gurudev. Okay. You will find that what is the primary motive of Sri.Narayana Gurudeva in his public journey? It was realizing the self. Right? And in realizing the self, he was able to empower the entire state. He realized the self. He went and he sat inside the Marthavamali cave and he meditated. And then he comes back with the spiritual energy. And because of that, he is able to empower the people naturally. And the social reformation happens as a side effect. Now you take the story of Narayana Guru, history of Narayana Guru. You will find that he learned, he belonged to the Ilava community, which was at that time even considered as unapproachable. This was definitely something that we all should be ashamed of. Okay. And he was a scholar of Sanskrit. From where he learned Sanskrit? He learned Sanskrit not in a fluke. Right? Somebody came and gave him Sanskrit knowledge. Nothing like that. He learned it from his uncle. And who was his uncle? His uncle was a person who was running a school for children in which he taught Sanskrit, Tamil and Malayalam. And also some herbal medicines and things. Okay. So, here is a person, his uncle also, he belonged to the same community. Here is a person who comes from the so-called unapproachable community. But he was a person who was well versed that he was running a school in which Sanskrit was taught, Tamil was taught, Malayalam was taught. So how do we make the whole thing, the puzzle fit? So there were this concept of pollution, there were this concept of the inhuman concept of untouchability and unapproachability. But the Vidya networks, the networks of cultural literacy and spiritual literacy, they were kept intact by all the communities, irrespective of whether they had the status or they didn't have the status. So because this was kept alive, at any time, when the time comes, you will be able to go up. Okay, that is number one, that we have to understand how these saints operated. The second thing is that Bhakti appealed to a common principle that connected us all, okay, which is the Atman. And because the Atman is there in everyone, then naturally there is a spiritual unity and spiritual equality. Once the spiritual equality is touched, all other inequalities become irrelevant. Okay. And once all other inequalities become irrelevant, then you can remove, with the people with that mindset, their critical mass increases in a particular community, in a particular society, and a particular time, they will be able to remove the inequalities. So this is the social emancipation model that the Bhakti movement and the Bhakti saints brought. And it has been repeatedly proved again and again. For example, you mentioned about Jnaneshwar. Okay. And Jnaneshwar's story is there in a compendium of the great Bhakti saints of the medieval period. Remember, in India, the historiography is not the history of dynasties. Okay. And I will take 5 more minutes to explain this. Okay. Acharya Vinoba Bhave. Acharya Vinoba Bhave was the student of and also a teacher of Mahatma Gandhi. He was the one who taught Sanskrit to Mahatma Gandhi. And he considered himself as a disciple of Mahatma Gandhi. So Acharya Vinoba Bhave had an ashram. In that ashram, a great educationist came. And he came to discuss about the education that India would have when India gets independence. So, when he was discussing about our great glorious kings whose history should be brought back and all that, he was telling in an excited manner. He was hearing all that, Vinoba Bhave. There was a gardener who was a Muslim. So Vinoba Bhave called that gardener and asked, do you know about Akbar? Then the gardener said, I don't know about Akbar. Okay, this happened right now 120 years before it should have happened. Then he asked him, do you know Tulsidas? Then the gardener said, yes, I know Tulasidas. I know Ramcharitmanas. Okay. Then he told that educationist, this is the real Indian history. The real Indian history is not the history of political dynasties. They are the history of the saints. They are the saints, the thoughts of the saints are the ones that animate ordinary people. If you are going to write a history, you have to write this history, not the history of political dynasties. If you are doing that, you are again following the British. Okay. So now, there is this compendium of all the great saints of the medieval period. In Tamil Nadu, you have this called Periya Puranam of all the Saivite saints. The same way. This is in the medieval period it was written, some 80 saints. You have the potters, you have dhobies, you have servant maids, you have housewives, you have thieves, you have all kind of people. But the common thing is they all loved Vittala. That is the common thing. Okay. So, there is this story of Jnaneshwar there in that. Jnaneshwar was excommunicated for whatever reasons, right? And then Jnaneshwar's father was excommunicated, so Jnaneshwar was considered as a kind of Chandala. And he was explaining the Gita and the Upanishads, and then some orthodox people came to him and said, you cannot do that. Basically, you are a Janma Chandala because your father has been excommunicated. And then Jnaneshwar, according to this Sri Mahabhakta Vichayam, which is a very famous thing, once upon a time, every household had this book of Mahabhakta Vichayam. Okay. So, then Jnaneshwar tells that even a buffalo can recite the essence of Vedas. You people don't know the essence of Vedas. Okay. Then the Brahmins are extremely angry, furious. They ask, then make a buffalo chant Veda. Then he tells a buffalo comes and he tells the buffalo, you chant Vedas. And it tells that I won't chant the entire Vedas, but the 4 essential aspects of for each Veda, I will give you one sentence. So the first sentence itself is from Manusmriti, which says that all are born Shudras, but by karma they become Brahmins. Okay. Remember, in Manusmriti, the meaning is different. All are born Shudras, by doing the Dvicha ceremonies, you become Brahmin. But here the meaning is changed. And it is told that by your karma, by your deeds, you become a Brahmin. And then it says, a great saint like Narada was born from the womb of a Dasi. So never ask the jati of a person, because it is through tabas that a person becomes a Brahmin. And then the same way he tells 2 more examples of sages who were born of so-called low births, and then they become great Maharishis. And then he tells, so never ask jati. So this kind of a spiritual democracy was created by these saints, and which was given to the people. They are the seeds thrown into the very fertile soil of the people. Whenever time came, it sprouted. That is how the Bhakti movement saints created the social emancipation.
Suraj sir, we know that many European and British scholars have tried to study and translate our indigenous books and help the other people understand it. So, isn't that a truly remarkable thing, or what would be your opinion on it? Also, sir, now there is this new theory of Aryan invasion, which is a new and upcoming theory. So, what is your stand behind it, or your idea behind it?
I'll try to address your first question, and the Aryan invasion theory I'll leave it to Aravindan sir to address. Many of the European scholars, one good thing about them is they all started studying about, when they came to India, they started studying about India. They started researching about India's various texts which they got from India. Like sir was mentioning about Manusmriti, if I rightly remember in the chapter 10, there is one verse which says, Vebhijarasya varnana, avedya veda vedacha, then it is like this, Sokarmanana Sokarmanana cha tyagena jayande varna sankara. This sloka starts with Vebhijarasya. This word is quite common nowadays. But here is an interesting aspect. In 1796, there came a scholar, and his name is William Jones. He translated that word as intermixture. In 1991, another scholar, Windy Doniger, she translated it as sexual misconduct. From intermixture, it became sexual misconduct. And in 2005, another scholar, Patrick Olive, Ulivelli, I think his name is like that. He translated the same word as adultery. Now, you don't need mastery over the colonial language to understand that there is a disparity in the translation. You don't need mastery in the colonial language to understand this. You don't even need mastery in Sanskrit language to understand that there is a problem in this translation. I'm not just showing one problem, like this is multiple problem. In a sense, one is many of the Western scholars couldn't able to understand the concepts properly. And what they did was like, the words which they were familiar with, from their theology, they inserted those words in our books, saying that, okay, fine, this is here. And now, the second problem in this translation is like they couldn't understand the culture of this land properly. I mean, like, Indologists, there are Indologists who have done good work. There are people who actually in a sense, they themselves have not understood the things properly and they have actually misrepresented things in their books. So this is an area where right now, what I would suggest is like, before appreciating any scholar, we need to critically examine each and every one of them. Like whether it is a Western scholar or whether it is an Indian scholar, we need to critically examine and cross-check all those writings properly. Or else we will also become the fanboys of the Western scholars. And like that has happened after post-independence time period. If you take Indian history writers, majority of them were actually breaking India forces. They all were belonging to the group called Breaking India Forces. So they were not interested in integrating our land. Their interest was to parrot whatever the colonial masters have done in India till 1947. And they did it and they are successful. Like if you talk to any students, like majority of them, even though they are not very familiar with the stream called social science or history, but many of them have deep-rooted ideas about India. And all these deep-rooted ideas are actually colonial ideas. So, for your question, my answer would be yes. I'm not saying no to read any colonial writer or any colonial scholar. We should read them, but we should not buy those arguments blindly. Like even Windy Doniger or even the modern day scholars. So that is my answer to your question. And when it comes to Aryan invasion theory, one scholar to suggest is Srikant Talakiri and the second one is Aravindan sir. He have done an extensive research in the topic, so I would pass that question to Aravindan sir.
When it comes to the Aryan invasion theory, from this particular topic's perspective, what we have to understand is that whether Aryan invasion is right or wrong, whether it is true or false, we are not getting into that. But a very fundamental question. We are told that the Aryans were the nomads from Central Asia, steppe, and they came inside here in waves. Okay, it was mostly this male-dominated waves of invasionists who came inside India, and then they created this Varna system and placed themselves as Brahmanas and Kshatriyas and mostly Vaishyas, and all the native people were made Shudras. Any sociology student worth his or her salt would understand one thing. A social structure like Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra cannot evolve in a nomadic society. They are already moving. There were bands of people who are moving in halls back from one place to another, destroying places, colonizing places and coming. How can they create a structure of Vaishyas, for example? Why do they need Vaishyas? You are nomads. Why do you need traders? You are nomads. Why do you need priests and kings? You don't need. You need chieftains and military generals. That's all. You don't need anybody else because you are nomads. So this very first thing that they created this structure is wrong. Okay, not going into the Aryan invasion proper. And the second thing, here you are telling that people are coming from outside and they are creating this, and then you go on creating binaries. The Aryan, Dravidian, Brahmin, non-Brahmin, non-Dalit, Dalit, non-tribal, tribal, classical art, folk art, So Folkart belongs to the Brahminical group. Brahminical groups were the Aryans. Aryans were the people who oppressed India for 5,000 years. This is the kind of mapping that you create. And this mapping had strongly entered into all the social sciences. You have to remember this. That is the danger of this particular thing. Knowingly or unknowingly, it has gone inside you. So whenever we are talking about jati, and you mentioned about the intermixing of jati and the kind of translation problems these people had with Bhagavad Gita. Let me tell you two facts about Bhagavad Gita in this aspect. Okay, one is that this take entire Bhagavad Gita. There is the term Jati Dharma, there is the term Kula Dharma. Okay, and there is also another one term called Swadharma. The terms Jati Dharma and Kula Dharma were used by Arjuna. When he was in his confused state of mind, he was talking about Jati Dharma and Kula Dharma. The entire discourse of Bhagavan, not once he uses the term Kula Dharma, not once. But he uses the term Swadharma again and again and again. And what is Swadharma based on? It is based on Swabhava. And what is Swabhava based on? It is based on your guna mixture. And what is your guna mixture based on? It is based on a lot of factors, including the kind of food that you take. Krishna tells that. Today you have something called microbiome, that what you eat, the guts can release that chemicals like neurotransmitters that can actually influence your aptitude, brain and everything. You should be knowing it better, right? And so the point is, here you have a text that rejects the concept of Kula Dharma and Swadharma in a very subtle way. It rejects. Krishna is not at once telling what kind of a fool are you, why you are using the term Kula Dharma. He is not talking like a progressive. But in a very mild way, he points out to Arjuna that these are irrelevant. Go for Swadharma. And then there is all the people, they quote about he created the 4 varnas and the 4 varnas are based on guna karma, and then they debate on what is guna karma, whether it is based on, if Krishna wanted, he could have used the term Kula Janma very clearly, but there is even more important statement in Daivasura Sampati Vibhaga Yoga where Krishna says very clearly, an asuric natured person calls himself as highborn. It clinches the issue. An asuric nature person calls himself a highborn person. So he was, yes, despite this fact, these people have been using this text again and again, okay, by these ontologies. And then they map it onto this Aryan invasion theory. Now we come to the archaeological or the genetic part of Aryan invasion theory. One very interesting phenomenon that you will find here is this again. Students here, you may feel sleepy, but you have to understand this very clearly because I am telling you, your future is in this, what I am going to tell you. In 2001, okay, there was a conference happening in South Africa. It was a conference of United Nations Human Rights Council, and they wanted to bring out a resolution against racism. At that time, activists from India, they went, supported by foreign groups, they went to the South African Turban, I think, they went there and they said that casteism is a form of racism. As if almost by coincidence, and there is no such thing as coincidence in this, a paper was presented in Nature Journal and it was given wide publicity. It was by Bamshed et al. So Bamshed and his team, they were from University of Utah, they studied the Jatis of India and they said that the upper castes have genetic similarity to the European, West Asian, West European genotype. And the so-called lower castes, they have more closer affinity to the so-called Dravidian or whatever. Okay, African genotypes. So they created this impression that the Jati system was actually a racial apartheid system. Okay, so think about it. 2001, exactly when there is a social activism going on, your science research paper comes that says this. Later, Kivizid et al. And a lot of people, they worked on the same paper. They found that you increase the sample size, then this association of the so-called upper caste genes with the genetic markers essentially with the other side disappears. This game has been going on again and again and again. You have a small sample, then you can fit it into your already existing historical theory. And that already existing theory is that Aryans came from outside. But the real fact is that, and a lot of people are working, there's a very good group that is working in BHU on ancient genome, okay, under Dr. Jnaneshwar Chaubey, and this is a very interesting work. He's a world famous ancient DNA and ancient people's migrations based on DNA and genetic studies. He is a master in that. And they have brought out a lot of work. What it shows is one thing, very, very beautiful thing it shows. It shows that there is no migration, okay? There is no invasion, there is no migration. There are a lot of interactions at the periphery, at all the areas where the people could come from other sides. There has been a lot of interaction. You have to go for an interaction model, and this interaction model, there has been genetic mixture, there has been cultural mixtures, and everything has been going on. What we can be very clear about is that this didn't happen and shape our social structures, okay? And another one added point is that when the Harappan society was studied by a person like Airavata Mahadevan, who is a impeccable scholar, he points out that the terminal signs in the Harappan seals, they show one sign he presents as a person with the priestly services. Another is a person with the military services. Another is a person who is a servant. And another is a person who is an ordinary person. Probably he was involved in trading. Exactly the Varna system that was already present in Harappan culture. So either you have to accept that Harappan culture is Vedic culture. In fact, Harappan culture is Vedic culture. Then this Aryan invasion theory naturally goes out.
Thank you, sir. That was definitely some very interesting information. And I'm sure that any one of us who reads anything new or hears something would definitely think twice about its fact or if it's actually true. Now, since we have roughly around 10 minutes left in this session, I think it's okay to open up the dais for question and answer session. The rules for this are very simple. Just try to ask brief, precise questions as possible due to our time constraint, and they'll be answered by the speakers. And anyone with further questions can definitely interact with them later on. So, anyone with any questions in the audience, you can ask your questions.
Good morning, everyone. So my question is to Suraj, sir. So you actually talked about the rivalry between Brahmin and Buddha. So we all know that King Ashoka converted to Buddhism, and he changed a lot after that. So why did he convert?
Like after the Kalinga war, the popular story says that after Kalinga war, Ashoka transformed into a very good, pious person, and he became a pacifist. And that is the popular story, okay, and we all bought those story, and we too started parroting the same story. But right now there are evidence to prove that Ashoka didn't change. Why? Because there is a book called Ashoka Vadana written by, it is a Sri Lankan chronicle actually, where there is an enough mention about Ashoka killing more than 15,000 Ajivakas at one shot. This happened after Kalinga. Again, he killed even many Jains after the Kalinga war. So these two facts proves that Ashoka didn't change a bit. But since you asked this question, I will pass this question to Aravindan sir, why? Because there could be more. Like there are many false stories, and this is one false story. And one scholar who have written extensively about this topic is Sanjeev Sanyal. So you may even read his book.
So here you see this particular story. This is one of the important stories that we learn when we go to school. When I went to school in second standard, they have taught this story about how Ashoka was so moved by this war, and then from Hinduism he got converted to Buddhism. Number one, there is no proof for this story, very strong proof for this story. Even in the rock edicts of Ashoka, he mentions about both the Brahmanas as well as the Shravanas and the Buddhist monks. And he calls himself Devanam Priya Ashoka, which is essentially he is the one who is dear to the Devas. Now, he didn't call himself Buddhanam Priya Ashoka. It is Devanam Priya Ashoka. So, that there is a lot of questions. As he said, it the Ashoka Vardhana, which was written by the Buddhists. It is a hagiography of Ashoka written by the Buddhists. And here you have a Jain painter. The Jain painter paints Buddha. He paints Mahavira and makes Buddha a Parivara Devata of this Jain Mahavira. So this guy gets very angry. Ashoka gets very angry. He tells that anybody who brings the head of a Jain monk, I would give this much number of amount of gold coins, 5 gold coins or something. So people start, kind of a hysteria breaks out and people starts bringing the heads of monks. But then Buddhist monks and the Jain monks, they both look alike. They both have full shaven heads. So what happens is one of the gurus of Buddhist gurus of Ashoka was also brought. His head was also brought. And then he realizes it's wrong and he stops. The point is, as he said, Ashoka, so-called conversion didn't change him. And it was not a big thing, positive thing in history. What it finally achieved was, it weakened the Mauryan Empire. The Greeks who were defeated, Seleucus Nicator was defeated by Chandragupta Maurya, driven away from India, but now they could come back. And they started challenging, and it was then that you have the Shunga dynasty coming and up and protecting India from the Greeks. So this conversion of Ashoka was more a myth, and later the Britishers, when they wrote the history of India, they did 2 interesting things in ancient history, which were, as I said, backward engineering. One is the story of Alexander and the Porus. So Porus gets defeated, brought before Ashoka, and he is asked, Alexander asks him, how do I treat you? And Porus says that, treat me like a king. So then Alexander hugs him and makes him his vassal. Okay. The real story is that, he defeated a few chieftains, and after that, before entering Magadha, an Indian clan, they attacked very fiercely Ashoka. Alexander, an arrow was shot, it entered him, and because of that, Alexander later in months or 2, he died. Okay. Now, think about the psychological impact of this Porus story. What the Britishers were telling through this story is that, we have conquered you, but we are ready to treat you in equal, so you be supplicant to us. We are a very civilized invaders. We massacred you, we created famines and all, but we are ready to treat you like equals. We are ready to give you clerk positions. So, show some gratitude to us. That is the story, the inner text of this story. But it is taught in all our schools even today. Right? The second story is this conversion of Ashoka. So the child is told, in a very subtle way, leaving Hinduism and getting converted is a positive thing. That subtext has been given there. So that is the purpose of this particular conversion story. I think we should, Dr. Ram will be talking about decolonization. One of the decolonization things that we have to do is we have to remove these 2 stories and bring out what really happened.
So my question is to Aravind sir. So when it comes to Jati, is there any way to avoid conflict and move forward?
We have to avoid conflict. We have to create harmony-oriented models. Okay. But at the same time, there is also social injustice that is existing. Last 200 to 300 years, a lot of injustices have been made part of the system. And then the blame has been put on Hinduism. Okay. So whether we like it or not, the blame has been put on Hindus. On entire Indian civilization. Why Hindus? Entire Indian civilization, the blame has been put. So we have to work very hard. We can't just say that it is not all our fault, but we have to work proactively to remove it. And to remove it, I would suggest that we can create a model of studying the problem first. And one of the models I would say should be based on Gita. Okay. So, if you take any newspaper that talks about an atrocity on the so-called Dalits, okay, what is the headline that is given? Caste Hindus torched the village of the quarters of Dalits. Caste Hindus did atrocities on Dalits. That is the headline, okay. What is the worldview behind this headline? It is that caste Hindu by nature, because of his religion, because of his casteist ideology, he is against the Dalits. Okay? So, your very diagnosis is wrong. You can't give proper solution. We have to abandon this diagnosis and we have to go for something called universal locals. Okay? What are these universal locals? In any community, in any society, there are resources. The resources are finite. The community would devise methods to economize these resources, and in that, if the resources are very limited and the mobility of the community is also very limited, caste structures would emerge. Okay? This may be a bit tough for you to understand. If you go and search a particular science fiction by Isaac Asimov, it is called Strike Breaker. Okay? It is available on the net, most probably. It should be available on the net. You will find these principles, these basic principles. Now, these are the principles that if a particular community has lower mobility and if the particular community is low on resources, then these caste hierarchies would come and they would become very rigid. Okay? If there are many resources, huge number of resources, the caste hierarchies are not necessary, they will get diluted. So in the Western countries, because of colonialism, they were able to amass a lot of wealth, and because of that, the caste hierarchies, they were existing there. Untouchability was there in Europe, okay? I am not talking about the black racism, I am talking about untouchability within the white people themselves, okay? You can go and search untouchability in ancient France, you will be able to find. Because a particular untouchable tried to take water from a particular fountain that belonged to the upper caste people, his hand was cut and the hand was pasted, was pinned to the door of the church because that would serve as a warning to other untouchables. This happened in France. So this was there everywhere. There it is now not visible. It is still there. It's not visible. It's not creating that much of a havoc. It's because they are having access to a lot of resources. Okay? So there are secular reasons for this. Now coming back here, how do we resolve these conflicts? Is we have to create a framework. And that for that framework, I can use the Bhagavad Gita, despite the fact that Bhagavad Gita is a text for individual liberation. It is a text for Jivan Mukti. It is not a text on sociology. We can take inspiration from it, insights from it. So he says, Krishna says that a person, when he hates the body of other persons, the hatred is always on the body of other persons. Okay? And when you are hating the body of other persons, you are also hating the Krishna who is inside him. The Andaryami, the Bhagavan who is inside that person. So ultimately you hate yourself. Every hatred ultimately is self-hatred. And these are all the factors that create that self-hatred of the other bodies. He says, one is ahankaram, palam, tarpam, kamam, krodham. Okay? These factors. You take any atrocity on the scheduled community people, you will find these 5 factors there acting on the dominant community against them. So you have to create a framework, you have to create verticals, you have to do a social psychological study of these conflicts based on these Gita principles or other dharmic principles, and then you will be able to create harmony-oriented models to address these problems.
So now we'll be concluding the Q&A session here. If any further questions are there, they'll definitely be taking them at a later time privately. So now to conclude today's session, today's dialogue, thank you Aravindan sir, thank you Suraj sir for providing us with such great information that definitely would make us think, and when we all go back, we would definitely think more about this topic. So to conclude, I think we can say that from today's discussion, that all these theories definitely need to be researched or thought upon more logically and empirically. And also the dominant Western theory of this caste system is false when it comes to defining the Indian social hierarchy. At a time like now, when multidisciplinary study and sciences is coming more into picture, I think it is a must for us Indians and definitely for us youth to research more on such topics, to come forward and to take up this task and ensure that the reality of all theories are brought forward. Thank you.